night Lyra turned 20, the sky above the Howling Clan's territory split open with a sound like the moon itself was screaming. Nobody expected it. Nobody was prepared for it. And nobody, not even the eldest elder who had lived through 3 generations of shifters and 2 lunar wars, had ever seen anything like what happened next. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because every story worth telling has a beginning, and Lyra's beginning was not one of magic or glory or golden light. Her beginning was mud and cold, and the particular kind of silence that fills a room when everyone decides you are not worth talking to. Lyra had grown up knowing exactly what she was in the eyes of the Howling Clan. She was the Beta's charity case, the small girl with the unremarkable gray eyes that Aldrich III Fang had dragged home from the border ruins 17 years ago when she was barely 3 years old, wrapped in a torn blanket that smelled of smoke and a mother who was already gone. Aldrich had never explained where she came from. He had simply placed her in his modest home at the edge of the clan's eastern quarter and declared that she would be raised as part of his household. And because Aldrich was quiet but respected, nobody had challenged him openly. They had simply made sure, in all the small and efficient ways that wolf packs have mastered over centuries, that Lyra understood her place. Her place was at the back of every line. Her place was the last portion at communal meals. Her place was the seat nearest the door in every gathering hall, the position that meant she was always the first to leave and the last to be remembered. She had internalized all of this with the patient, watchful stillness of someone who has learned that protest costs more than it gains. She studied. She observed. She helped in the clan's healing house, because the healer Mira was old enough to not care about hierarchy and young enough in spirit to appreciate an extra pair of steady hands. Lyra learned to set bones and clean wounds and brew the bitter medicines that kept fever from taking the young pups through winter. She was good at it. She was good at many things that nobody thought to notice. What she was not good at, what she had never been good at, was shifting. In a wolf clan, a child's first shift typically came between the ages of 14 and 16. It was a landmark event, celebrated with the marking feast and the formal assignment of a wolf name that sat alongside the human name. Lyra had watched every one of her age mates go through it. She had watched Petra, who had always been her closest thing to a friend, collapse to the ground in the beautiful agony of first transformation at 15, and rise as a sleek silver wolf that made the alpha's eyes go soft with approval. She had watched even Dren, the boy everyone called slow and kind, find his shift at 16 and a half. She had stood at the edges of every marking feast for 6 years, watching the firelight play on faces flushed with triumph and belonging, and she had smiled and applauded, and carried the serving trays and gone home to her small room in Aldrich's house, and pressed her face into her pillow and tried very hard not to make any sound at all, because the rule was clear. The clan's law was older than anyone living, and harder than the granite mountains that ringed their territory. If a born shifter had not found their form by their 20th birthday, they were no longer considered a true member of the pack. They were declared formless, and the formless were cast out. Aldrich had never spoken to her about it directly. He was not a man who spoke about difficult things directly. But in the weeks leading up to her 20th birthday, Lyra had noticed him watching her with an expression she had never seen on his weathered face before. Something complicated and sorry and defeated all at once. He had started leaving extra food portions in her room without explanation. He had mended her boots without being asked. Small, clumsy acts of a man trying to apologize for something he did not know how to name. She had not shifted. She had tried. Gods, how she had tried. Standing alone in the forest in the cold dark of every new moon, willing her body to understand what every other body in this territory seemed to know instinctively. She had tried until she was shaking and exhausted, and sat down in the leaves, and pressed her hands against her sternum, and felt the thing that lived there. The warm, pulsing thing that was not quite like the wolf fire she had heard others describe, but was something, some presence, some coiled, waiting energy that never answered her calls no matter how desperately she reached for it. On the morning of her 20th birthday, the clan's second elder, a woman named Vorha, whose opinion of Lyra had always been efficiently communicated through her silence, arrived at Aldrich's door with 2 witnesses and a scroll, and formally informed Lyra that she had until moonrise to present her wolf form or be escorted to the border. Aldrich stood behind Lyra and said nothing. His hands were shaking at his sides. Lyra thanked Vorha politely, closed the door, and went to sit on the edge of her bed and stare at the wall for a very long time. She spent that day in the healing house. Mira knew, of course. The old healer had known for weeks what was coming, and she had said nothing about it because Mira's particular form of love was practical and unsentimental, which meant she had spent those weeks teaching Lyra every remaining piece of medical knowledge she possessed, compressing years of learning into days with the focused urgency of someone preparing a traveler for a very long road. They worked side by side in the familiar smell of herbs and dried bark and clean linen, and neither of them mentioned what the day was. And when evening came, Mira pressed a small wrapped package into Lyra's hands and told her to open it later, and then turned back to her mortar and pestle and did not look up again. The pack gathered at moonrise. This was also tradition. The formal casting out was not done in secret or in shame, but publicly, in the central clearing, because the pack's laws were meant to be witnessed. Lyra stood in the center of the gathered wolves and felt their eyes on her, and kept her chin level and her breathing steady, and thought about all the ways she had already survived things that were supposed to break her. The Alpha, a broad man named Corvin, whose authority was genuine if his warmth was not, read the formal words from memory. Formless, released from the pack's bond, no longer under the pack's protection. She was to take what she could carry and not return. And that was when the sky split open. It did not happen gradually. There was no warning tremor, no shift in the air pressure, no intuitive animal sense that something vast was about to change. One moment Lyra was standing in the clearing with her chin up and her eyes dry, listening to the words of her formal dismissal. And the next moment, something inside her chest that had been coiled and waiting and silent for 20 years simply stopped waiting. The pain was extraordinary. She had heard people describe the first shift as painful, as a breaking and remaking. But this was something categorically different from what those descriptions had prepared her for. This felt like being unmade at the cellular level, like every atom in her body was being asked to remember something it had always known and had never been permitted to express. She heard herself cry out, a sound that tore the gathered crowd's silence like a blade through silk. And then she was on her hands and knees in the dirt, and the clearing was full of a light that had no business being there. A cold silver radiance that came from her skin, from inside her skin, from some place beneath the skin that had no name. The wolves around her stepped back. She heard their sounds of alarm, of awe, of something edging toward fear, and she could not pay attention to any of it because the transformation was taking her completely, reshaping her with a ferocity that left no room for consciousness of anything except the process itself. Her hands against the dirt changed. Her fingers lengthened and narrowed and darkened, and the nails became something else entirely, curved and sharp, and not at all the claws of a wolf. Her shoulders pulled together and then apart. Her spine, elongated and curved in ways spines were not meant to curve. The silver light intensified until it was blinding, and the gathered wolves were shielding their eyes. And someone, she thought it might have been Corvin, was shouting something she could not parse through the roaring in her ears. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Lyra had ever experienced. She was aware of herself differently. She was aware of the air in a way she had never been before, of the thermal currents rising from the warm bodies around her, of the specific gravity of the night sky above, as though it were something she could read and navigate. She was aware of her own weight, as both present and optional. She turned her head and saw through eyes that were sharper and more dimensional than any eyes she had possessed before. And she saw the faces of the howling clan, staring at her with expressions she had never seen directed at her in her entire life. Corvin's face had gone completely white. Vorha's scroll had dropped from her fingers. Even the children, who rarely understood the politics of the adults around them, were pressed back against their parents with wide eyes, not from threat, but from a specific kind of overwhelmed reverence that children sometimes experience in the presence of things that are genuinely, undeniably extraordinary. Lyra looked down at herself, at her wings. They were enormous. They were black, but not the flat black of ordinary darkness. They were the black of deep water and open sky and the space between stars, a black that held within it every other color, the way a prism holds light. And when they moved, when she instinctively extended them to their full span, with a sound like silk across stone, she heard the assembled wolves make a collective sound that was half gasp and half something that had no name in their language. The golden markings appeared as the wings settled. They ran along the primary feathers in patterns that were not random, that were clearly, deliberately, impossibly script, the old script, the one that predated written language and existed only in the oldest of the holy texts that the clan scholars argued over in firelit rooms while their younger packmates rolled their eyes. Lyra could not read it, but several people in that clearing could, and the ones who could went very, very still. The Arado had come. If you are the kind of person who has been waiting for this story and did not know you were waiting for it, then you already feel what that word means. And if you are new here, then let me tell you, and please stay with me, because the next part changes everything. The word Arado, the herald, the raven-born of Wolf and Moon, was not simply a mythological figure from the clan's oldest stories. It was a specific prophecy with specific terms and specific consequences, and those consequences had been the subject of debate among the supernatural world scholars and rulers for 1,000 years, precisely because nobody had been certain the Arado would ever actually appear, because its appearance meant one of two things. It meant either the beginning of the end of the wolf kingdoms as they existed, or the beginning of something that had never existed before. The prophecy did not specify which. The prophecy was, like all truly consequential prophecies, infuriatingly open to interpretation, and the interpretation depended entirely on one factor, on whether the herald chose destruction or salvation, on whether the herald was met with a blade or a bond. The Arado's choice was not made in isolation. The prophecy specified a mate. It specified a king, and it specified that the meeting between the Raven Herald and the Alpha King would determine the direction of the choice. This was the part that the scholars had argued about most ferociously, because it raised an uncomfortable question about whether destiny was something that happened to you, or something that happened because of you. Kaelin had been hearing about this prophecy since he was 7 years old, and his father had sat him down in the great map room of the Thornwall Palace and explained with the precise emotional temperature of a man who ruled through calculation, rather than feeling that there was one threat Kaelin must always be prepared for. Not enemy armies, not political rivals, not the ancient magic of the deep forests or the territorial disputes at the borders, or any of the 100 dangers that came with ruling the largest and most contested wolf kingdom in the known supernatural world. The one threat was a raven with golden script on its feathers, and when it appeared, his duty was clear. Kaelin's father, King Aldous II, had been a man who understood power so completely that he had lost the ability to experience it as anything other than a mathematical problem. Love, loyalty, legacy, all of these were variables in equations. The prophecy of the Arado was simply another variable, and the correct solution was elimination. Kill the herald before the bond can form. No herald, no prophecy. No prophecy, no uncertainty. And Aldous had raised his son in his own image with the methodical patience of a craftsman, shaping Kaelin into something equally cold and equally effective. A king who could make any decision the throne required without flinching. Or so Aldous had believed. He had not accounted for the fact that children raised in coldness sometimes develop, in their secret, interior lives, precisely the warmth that has been denied to them. The way plants will grow toward any available light, regardless of how small the source. Kaelin had learned to hide this. He had learned to hide it so well that by the time he ascended the throne at 24 after his father's death from a rare shifter's illness, he was broadly considered to be exactly what Aldous had intended to create. The court feared him, and respected him in approximately equal measure. His generals trusted his strategy. His subjects were safe under his laws, even if they were not particularly comfortable under his temperament. He ruled the 4 territories with an efficiency that was genuinely impressive and a personal warmth of approximately absolute zero. He had informants in every major clan. This was not paranoia so much as policy. Information was the first component of power, and Kalen's information network was the finest in the supernatural world, which was why, when the howling clans' clearing erupted with silver light, and the impossible transformation of a small gray-eyed girl into a creature that had not walked or flown, or existed in 1,000 years, Kalen knew about it before the dew had finished forming on the morning grass. He received the message in the form of his spy master, a lean woman named Sable, whose talent for moving undetected through any environment had made her invaluable, arriving at the door of his private study at 4 a.m, with the particular expression she reserved for information that required his immediate personal attention. She told him what had been witnessed. She told him the golden script had been confirmed by 3 independent scholars who had been in the vicinity, 2 of them from clans who had no reason to fabricate the detail. She told him the girl's name was Lyra, and that she had been raised as a foundling in the Howling clan's eastern quarter, that her origins were unknown, that she had been in the process of being formally exiled as formless when the shift had occurred. Kalen listened to all of this without moving from his chair. When Sable finished, he was quiet for a long moment, in the way that he was quiet when he was processing something against multiple frameworks simultaneously. A thinking silence rather than a hesitant one. Then he said, "Send the contingent. I want her brought here, alive and unharmed." Sable had served him for 8 years, and had excellent control of her facial expressions. Even so, she blinked. Not the order she had expected. The order she had expected was the one his father had drilled into the kingdom's contingency protocols for exactly this eventuality. She did not say this. She simply asked if he wanted the standard diplomatic approach or the extraction protocol. He said the diplomatic approach, and he said it with a finality that told her the subject was closed. After she left, he sat for a very long time in the dark of his study and looked at nothing in particular and thought about a prophecy he had memorized at 7 years old, and he thought about what it meant that his first instinct upon hearing that the Arauto had appeared was not what his father's voice in his head was telling him it should be. His first instinct had been something uncomfortably close to relief, as though some part of him had been waiting for exactly this, for the arrival of the variable that would force the equation to resolve into something other than the endless cold calculation his life had become. He did not examine this instinct too closely. Not yet. Lyra, meanwhile, was experiencing her second extraordinary thing of the evening, which was the discovery that transforming back from raven to human form was significantly easier than the initial transformation had been, and that in her human form she retained certain qualities that she had not possessed before. Her senses were sharper. The darkness was more navigable. She could feel air currents on her skin. As information, the way she imagined a raven in flight would feel them, and there was a new awareness at the edges of her consciousness. Not quite a voice and not quite a direction, but something between the two, a gentle magnetic pull that she did not understand and could not explain, and instinctively filed away for later examination, because the more immediate situation demanded attention. The more immediate situation was that the Howling clan's Alpha was looking at her with an expression she had never seen directed at anything, somewhere between reverence and calculation, and the particular alarm of a man who has just realized that the script of a situation has been rewritten without his knowledge. Corvin was not a stupid man. He knew the prophecy. He knew what the golden script on her wings meant. He also knew, with the practical intelligence of a political survivor, that the status of a person who had just revealed herself to be a figure of ancient prophecy was considerably more complicated than the status of a formless foundling being formally exiled. He called off the exile. He did it with the smooth efficiency of a man who was already reframing the narrative in his own mind, already preparing the version of events that would serve him best. He offered Lyra the clan's hospitality, a guest's quarters, a place at the main table. He did all of this with a warmth that was perfectly calibrated and entirely unconvincing to Lyra, who had spent 20 years reading the political temperature of every room she entered as a survival mechanism, and was therefore very well equipped to recognize performance when she saw it. She accepted graciously. She ate the food that was offered. She sat in the guest room that was frankly much nicer than her old room in Aldrich's house, and she opened Mira's package and found inside it a small journal and a folded note in Mira's cramped handwriting that said only, "I always knew you were something they didn't have a word for. Be careful who you let name you." Lyra held the note for a long time and breathed very carefully, and then tucked it inside the journal and tucked the journal inside her shirt against her heart. She slept for 3 hours and then sat up in the pre-dawn darkness and thought about what had happened and what it meant and what came next. She was aware that she did not know enough. The prophecy that everyone seemed to recognize from her appearance was not something she had been taught. The Howling Clans. Elders had not exactly been in the habit of sharing ancient lore with the formless foundling in the Eastern Quarter. She needed information. She needed to understand what she was and what was expected of her, and what the golden script on her feathers actually said. And she needed to do this before anyone else decided to make that decision for her. The delegation from the 4 territories arrived 3 days later. Lyra had not been idle in those 3 days. She had spoken with Corvin's elder, Scholar, an ancient man named Bet, who was genuinely overjoyed by her existence in the way that academics sometimes experience joy at the appearance of the thing they have spent a lifetime studying, and who had provided her with more information in 3 afternoon sessions than she had gathered in 20 years of careful listening. She understood now, in broad strokes, what the prophecy said. She understood that the Arota was described as a being of absolute balance, neither wolf nor bird, neither destruction nor creation, holding the capacity for both. She understood that the prophecy described a meeting between the Raven Herald and the Alpha King of the 4 territories as the fulcrum of the choice. She understood that this meeting had been anticipated for 1,000 years, and that powerful forces had spent those years preparing for it in different ways, some hoping to guide it toward one outcome, and some toward the other. What Bet could not tell her, because the prophecy did not say, was what the choice would actually look like, or how she would know she was making it. He was sympathetic about this limitation. Prophecies, he explained with the gentle apology of someone who has spent a career translating ambiguous documents, were more useful as retrospective explanations than prospective guides. They described what would be more clearly after it had been. She thanked him anyway, and went back to her guest room and stared at the ceiling. She was sitting in the eastern courtyard when the delegation arrived, feeding the clan's communal chickens in a gesture of normalcy that she found grounding, and she was therefore in an excellent position to observe their arrival without appearing to observe it. She watched the 12 riders come through the clan's gates in the particular formation that spoke of professional discipline, watched the way the clan's people in the courtyard subtly rearranged themselves in response, the small unconscious performances of pack animals, acknowledging a superior hierarchy. She noted the crest on the banner, a wolf's head in profile with a crown of thorns, the sigil of the Thornwall throne. She noted also the man who was not quite leading the delegation, but around whom the delegation oriented itself the way iron filings orient around a magnetic source. The man who dismounted with the economic grace of someone who had been on horseback for most of his life, and stood in the courtyard with the particular quality of stillness that belonged to people who had never had to prove that they were the most dangerous thing in any given room. He was tall and dark-haired, and coldly handsome in the architectural way of someone whose features had been arranged by genetics for maximum authority rather than approachability. His eyes swept the courtyard in a professional assessment that paused, for exactly 1 fraction of 1 second, on Lyra, where she sat with her chicken feed. She held the eye contact for the fraction of a second, and then looked back down at the chickens. If you are thinking, as many people in this story were also thinking, that this was not the most auspicious beginning to the meeting, that a 1,000-year-old prophecy had been building toward, you are not wrong, but you are also perhaps underestimating the significance of that fraction of a second. Kaelin, who had been trained since childhood to read people in the way that an expert reader reads a page, had registered several things in that brief moment. He had registered that she was not performing for him. He had registered that her calm was genuine rather than suppressed. He had registered that her eyes, which were the gray of deep water rather than the silver or gold he had perhaps unconsciously expected in the eyes of a mythological figure, held a quality of assessment that matched his own. And he had registered something else, something that he did not have a ready framework for, because it had not happened to him before. A recognition that ran deeper than cognitive processing and sat in the chest like a key finding the lock it was always meant for. He did not catalog this feeling or examine it. He set it aside with the practiced discipline of a man who had been setting aside inconvenient feelings for 20 years and went to meet the clan's alpha. The formal presentation happened in Corvin's great hall. Lyra was brought in as the subject of the delegation's interest, which she found both appropriate and faintly absurd, sitting across a long table from a king she had been given 3 days to learn about, while he had presumably been learning about her for significantly longer. She wore the best clothing she owned, which was not impressive, but she wore it with the specific self-possession that comes from not having any energy to spare for self-consciousness. Kaelin sat across from her, and his expression was impeccably neutral, and she was very good at reading people, and she read nothing in his face and found this more interesting than anything she had read in Corvin's face in 20 years. Kaelin spoke first. He said, "I am told you are the Herald." She said, "I am told the same thing." He said, "And what is your opinion on the matter?" She said, "I think I transformed into a raven in front of 200 witnesses who recognized the golden script from the old texts. Opinion seems like the wrong framework." Something moved in his eyes. Not warmth exactly. Something more like a recalibration. He said, "I would like you to come to Thornwall, as a guest, to discuss the implications of the prophecy with my scholars." She said, "What happens if I decline?" The question landed in the room with the specific weight of a thing that nobody had expected to be said. Corvin made a small strangled sound. Kaelin's expression did not change, but the quality of his attention sharpened in a way she could feel across the table. He said, "Nothing would happen to you. You are not required to comply," she said. He said, "But the forces that are interested in the prophecy's outcome are not all as willing as I am to respect your agency in this matter. There are parties who would prefer the outcome to be determined before you have the information to make an informed choice." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the old scholar Bet, and the thing he had said about the prophecy's 2 outcomes, and the parties who had spent 1,000 years preparing for this moment. She thought about the magnetic pull she had been feeling at the edges of her consciousness since the night of her transformation, that gentle pressure that seemed to have a direction, if not a destination. She thought about Mira's note tucked against her heart. "Be careful who you let name you," she said. "I would like to know what the golden script says. All of it." He said, "That can be arranged." She said, "And I would like Mira, the healer from this clan. I want her to come with me." Another small sound from Corvin, who clearly had not anticipated losing his healer as part of this negotiation. Kaelin simply nodded. She said, "Then yes, I'll come. And if you want to stop here and leave a comment telling me what you think is going to happen next, I will tell you that you are both right and wrong in ways that will make sense later, because this story is not the story you have heard before, even if it has the shape of a familiar one. So stay with me." The journey to Thornwall took 4 days on horseback. Lyra had not ridden much. The Howling Clan's eastern quarter was not a neighborhood of riders. She managed adequately and did not complain, which she understood, Kaelin noted, because he was someone who noted things. She rode near the middle of the formation as befitted a guest rather than a prisoner, and Mira rode beside her with the philosophical equanimity of a woman who had spent 60 years being unruffled by extraordinary circumstances, and they talked in low voices about herbs and weather and the particular qualities of the soil in different regions as determined by what grew there. She found this profoundly steadying. Kaelin rode at the front of the formation. He did not speak to her during the journey except at the stops, and then only practically, asking if she needed anything, ensuring the camp arrangements were adequate. He was unfailingly courteous in the specific way of someone who has been raised to understand that courtesy is a form of power. She was courteous in return in the specific way of someone who has been raised to understand that courtesy costs nothing and reveals nothing. They were, she reflected on the third evening sitting by the campfire while Mira slept, very evenly matched in their mutual opacity. What she could not fully account for was the other thing. The pull that she had felt since the night of her transformation had been vague and directionless in the Howling Clan's territory, more of a general pressure than anything specific. Since Kaelin had arrived, it had become something considerably more focused. It pointed at him with the unambiguous fidelity of a compass needle pointing north, and it had the quality, the infuriating, unmistakable quality, of something she recognized from the old texts she had been reading about mate bonds. She was not ready to think about this. She was not anywhere near ready to think about this. She filed it in the same folder as everything else she was not yet ready to think about, and kept her expression pleasantly neutral and watched the fire. On the fourth evening, she looked up from the fire and found him watching her. He looked away immediately with the disciplined speed of someone who had not intended to be caught, and she thought about what it meant that the Alpha King of the 4 territories, the coldest and most calculated ruler in the supernatural world, had been watching a foundling ex-raven sitting by a campfire when he could have been sleeping, and she thought that maybe she was not the only one. Experiencing the compass needle. Thornwall Palace was not what she had imagined, which was foolish in retrospect, because she had never been anywhere particularly impressive, and had therefore been imagining it based on descriptions rather than experience. It was vast in the way of things that have been built over centuries by people who intended them to last forever. Stone and iron and ancient timber and gardens that had been growing and layering and accumulating their own kind of authority for as long as the pack had held this territory. It was not beautiful exactly. It was formidable. It was the architectural expression of a power that was not interested in your opinion of it. She was given rooms in the guest wing that were larger and better furnished than anything she had ever occupied, and she spent the first hour doing a systematic and thorough inventory of every exit, which was a habit she had developed over 20 years of occupying spaces on sufferance, and which she saw no reason to abandon simply because the circumstances had improved. Mira approved. The old healer took the adjoining room and immediately began investigating the medicinal garden she could see from the window with professional interest. The scholars came the next morning. 3 of them, solemn and clearly excited in the way that scholars are excited, which is to say with an air of suppressed urgency beneath a practiced calm, and they spread the texts across the long table in the room that had been designated as her study space, and they showed her the golden script. They showed her what it said. And let me tell you, because you deserve to know this alongside Lyra, because you have been patient, and I do not want to be coy about the thing that changes everything. The script said, born of wolf, but not wolf. Born of sky, but not sky. The herald carries in one hand the flame that ends the age of kings, and in the other, the seed of the age of equals. The choice is not of destruction or salvation, for both are true in both hands. The choice is of when, and the choice belongs entirely to the herald. But the herald does not choose alone, for the bond of the raven and the crown is the scale on which the choice is weighed, and the bond once made cannot be unmade by any will save their own. Should the bond be made in truth, the age of equals begins. Should the bond be broken by force, the flame rises. She sat with this for a long moment. Then she said to the scholars, "What is the bond?" Of the raven and the crown. The eldest scholar, a woman named Tira, with silver in her braids and a quality of long patience in her eyes, said, "We believe it is the mate bond between the Arauto and the ruling Alpha King." Lyra said, "And if the mate bond is never acknowledged or accepted?" Tira said, "The prophecy does not specify. We believe it exists in a form of suspension. It does not dissipate. It waits." Lyra said, "And the Alpha King, does he know this interpretation?" Tira said yes. Commissioned this translation himself 4 days ago, when he learned of your appearance. She thanked them and asked them to leave the texts, and sat alone with the words for 2 hours. She sat with the particular quality of stillness she had developed over 20 years of situations that required her to think clearly, despite feeling rather a lot. And she thought about what it meant that the prophecy's outcome depended not on her power or her choice alone, but on whether a bond between herself and The man who had been raised to kill her was made in truth, and she thought about what in truth might mean, because the phrase was not incidental, it was specific, and the old texts were specific when they were specific for a reason. In truth, not by force, not by manipulation, not by political arrangement or mutual calculation, by truth. She thought about what she knew of Kaelin, which was relatively little and mostly external. She thought about what she had observed, which was more useful. She thought about the fraction of a second in the courtyard, and the campfire on the fourth night, and the compass needle that had not moved since the delegation arrived in the Howling Clan's territory. She thought about what it meant that he had said, "Nothing would happen to you. You are not required to comply," in a voice that had the specific texture of a truth rather than a strategy. She thought about what it meant that he had sent for her as a guest rather than as a threat eliminated. She thought about his father's protocol, which Tira had mentioned carefully, the elimination order that had been in the kingdom's contingency plans for a generation. She thought about the fact that Kaelin had countermanded it. She did not yet know what to make of him, but she was beginning to think that whatever she made of him would be worth making carefully. If you are still with me here, and I hope you are because we are approaching the part that I have been building toward, and I want you to feel it the way it deserves to be felt, then I want you to take a breath and consider the situation from Kaelin's perspective for a moment, because his situation is not simple, and he deserves to be understood rather than simply observed. Kaelin had spent 24 years being his father's creation, and then 4 more years ruling in his father's image, or close enough to it that the difference was invisible to most observers. He had been efficient and cold and effective, and he had slept well and eaten properly and exercised his power with the clean, joyless competence of a machine that runs without passion because passion introduces error. He had been, by most measurable standards, a successful king. He had not been a happy man. He had not allowed himself to examine whether he was happy, because that examination would have led somewhere his training told him was dangerous. The arrival of the prophecy had cracked something, not shattered it, not yet, but created a fissure through which something was beginning to move that he was having increasing difficulty suppressing with the standard toolkit of discipline and denial. Because the woman sitting in his guest quarters with her gray deep-water eyes and her complete absence of performance was doing something to his carefully maintained internal architecture that he had not been prepared for, and the thing she was doing was not reducible to the mate bond's magic, or not only to that, because what she was doing felt less like being pulled toward something and more like being seen by something. And Kaelin had not been seen. Genuinely seen as opposed to assessed or feared or politically evaluated, since he was approximately 7 years old, and his mother had still been alive to see him. He went to her study on the evening of her second day at Thornwall. He did not announce himself in advance, not because he was trying to catch her off guard, but because he had found that when he announced himself, people had time to prepare their performance, and he was tired of performances. He knocked and waited, and she said, "Come in," with the voice of someone who had already assessed from the sound of the knock, who was there, and had decided to let him in anyway. She was sitting with the text still spread before her, and she had made notes in the margins of her own paper, in a handwriting that was small and precise and slightly cramped, the handwriting of someone who had learned to make efficient use of limited paper. She looked up at him and waited and did not perform anything. He sat down across from her without asking permission, which was technically appropriate, given that it was his palace, but which he was aware could also be read as dominance assertion, and which he intended as neither, simply as the act of a man who had decided that the usual social choreography was not what this conversation needed. He looked at the texts. He looked at her notes. He said, "What do you think?" She said, "I think the prophecy is considerably less apocalyptic than the popular interpretation suggests." He said, "Explain." She said, "Everyone talks about it as though it's describing a catastrophe in either direction. The end of the wolf kingdoms, or their salvation. But the text doesn't say that. It says the age of kings ends. That's specific. It says the age of equals begins. Also specific. Those aren't catastrophe and salvation. They're a transition. The question is, whether the transition happens through flame or through the bond, and the flame isn't described as necessarily more destructive than the bond, just as a different path to the same destination. He was very quiet for a moment. He said, that interpretation would require the existing power structures to change, regardless. She said yes. He said, including mine. She said, yes. He looked at her steadily, and she looked back at him with the same quality she had brought to the chicken courtyard and the campfire, and every other moment in which the appropriate response would have been to manage his perceptions, rather than simply be present to his observation of her. He said, my father would have had you killed. She said, I know. He said, I was raised with very explicit instructions about what to do if you appeared. She said, I know that too. I've been doing my research. He said, and she said, and you didn't follow them. The silence between them had a texture this time. Not uncomfortable exactly. Something more like the specific atmospheric quality of the moment before a season changes, when the air holds both what was and what is about to be. He said, I want to understand the prophecy's outcome before I act on it in either direction. She said, that seems reasonable. He said, I also. There was a pause, unusual for him, a genuine hesitation rather than a rhetorical one. He said, I also want to understand you, before anything else is decided. I would like to know who you are independent of what you represent. Something shifted in her expression, something small and contained that she brought back under control quickly, but that he caught because he was very good at catching small things. She said, that's an unusual thing for a king to say. He said, I'm discovering that the usual approaches may not be adequate to the current situation. She said, they're usually not. Then she said, what would you like to know? And they talked. They talked for 3 hours that first evening, in the study with the old texts spread between them. And what they talked about was not the prophecy, and was not the mate bond, and was not the political implications of the Arauto's appearance in a wolf kingdom governed by a man with an elimination protocol. They talked about what she had learned from the healer Mira, and what she had loved about the work, and why she had stayed in a community that didn't want her, rather than attempting to build a life elsewhere. They talked about what he had been like as a child before his father had finished building him, which required him to reach back to parts of himself he hadn't accessed in years, and he did it with the care of someone handling something fragile. They talked about the old texts and what they said about the age of equals, and what that might actually look like in practice, as opposed to in prophecy. They talked about power, and what it was for, and what it cost. She did not perform gratitude or deference. He did not perform authority or certainty. And when she finally said that, she needed to sleep, and he stood, and the compass needle in her chest pointed at him with its unwavering patience. She looked at it with more curiosity than fear, and thought that maybe the truth the prophecy required would be simpler and harder than either of them had anticipated. Not a grand gesture or a political arrangement or a magical event. Just this. 2 people in a room deciding to be honest. He said goodnight and walked back to his own wing and sat in his private study for an hour in the dark, doing nothing visible and a great deal invisible. And what he was doing invisibly was dismantling, carefully and irreversibly, the framework his father had built in him around the concept of what a king could and could not afford to feel. And if you want to go ahead and hit the like button, because you can already feel where this is going, please do, because it makes the story worth telling. The weeks that followed were the strangest and most productive of Lyra's life. Thornwall's resources were extraordinary compared to everything she had previously had access to, the libraries alone containing more information than she had hoped to read in a lifetime, and she threw herself into study with the focused energy of someone who has been given access to something they have been hungry for longer than they knew. Tira the scholar became an ally in the genuine sense, not a politically convenient ally, but one of those rarer relationships built on mutual intellectual respect and the pleasure of working with someone who asks good questions. Mira made friends with the palace healer and promptly began reorganizing the medicinal stores in ways that improved everything and offended nobody, which was characteristic. Lyra practiced her raven form. She went to the private courtyard in the early mornings when the palace was still, and the sky was beginning to lighten, and she transformed and flew. And flying was the one thing in her new life that was entirely without complication. A pure, physical joy that she had not known was possible for her. The raven form was responsive and exact, and the air was a language she was beginning to learn fluently, reading its moods and currents the way she read people, with the particular pleasure of a skill being honed. She flew further each morning as her confidence grew, learning the geography of the Thornwall territory from above, the forests and the rivers, and the small villages, and the vast farmland that fed the pack. Kalen was in the courtyard on the 6th morning. He was there before her, sitting on a stone bench with a mug of something warm and a document he did not appear to be reading. And when she landed and shifted back to human form, he looked up without the performance of having been absorbed in the document and said, "You're faster than yesterday." She said, "I'm learning the updrafts above the eastern forest." "They're efficient," he said. "I saw you circle the ridge twice. What were you looking at?" She said, "The construction on the southern road. I was trying to understand the route." He said, "I can show you the maps." She said, "I'd like that." He folded the unread document and set it aside, and it occurred to her that he came to the courtyard because she came to the courtyard, and that this was not something he had needed to conceal, because she already knew, and they both knew she knew. And this was the particular texture of the honesty they were building. Slowly, without ceremony, without anyone giving it a name. They developed habits. Morning in the courtyard, 3 evenings per week in the study with the texts, Sundays at the long window in the map room where he showed her the territories, and she asked questions about the political arrangements that had created the borders, and he answered more fully than he would have answered anyone else, because she asked questions that required full answers. She sat in on 2 of his council meetings at his invitation as an observer, and watched the way the council members navigated around him like ships navigating around a reef they respected and wished was not there. She made notes afterward and shared them with him, and he read them with the attention he gave to information that was genuinely useful, because she saw things in the room that his position inside it prevented him from seeing. The council did not know what to make of her. The supernatural world's news of the Arauto's appearance had spread, as such things spread, through the network of clans and packs and smaller supernatural communities, and opinion was divided in the way that opinion divides when something arrives that challenges existing categories. Some thought she was dangerous. Some thought she was the fulfillment of a salvation they had been promised. Some thought she was being used by the Alpha King in ways that would serve his agenda at the expense of the prophecy's true meaning. Some simply found the whole situation fascinating in the detached way of people who are not personally invested in the outcome. Vorha appeared at Thornwall on the 3rd week. Not Vorha personally, but Vorha's representative, a young man named Kel, who had clearly been selected for the mission because of his ability to look harmless. He came with gifts from the Howling clan, and a message of congratulation from Corvin that was so transparently a political repositioning that Lyra had to work to keep her expression appropriate. The real message, delivered in a private moment that Kel, engineered with more skill than his harmless appearance suggested, was from Vorha herself, and it said in essence that there were those within the clan leadership who felt strongly that the Arauto's power should remain under the influence of her birth pack and that she should be mindful of who was guiding her choices. Lyra thanked Kel for the message and the gifts, and suggested he convey her warmest regards to the elder and to Corvin, and then she went to find Kalen and told him about it, without embellishment, and watched his expression for what it revealed. What it revealed was a very brief and entirely genuine flash of anger on her behalf, quickly contained, and then a careful analysis of the political implications, and then at the end, an inquiry about whether she was all right. She said, "I've been managing people who wanted to use me since I was 3 years old. I'm reasonably skilled at it." He said, "That doesn't mean it isn't tiring." She looked at him for a moment longer than she usually permitted herself. She said, "It is actually tiring." Yes. He said nothing else about it, But when they met for their evening session with the texts later that day, there was tea, which had not previously been a feature of the evening sessions, in the exact variety she had mentioned in passing 2 weeks ago as being the one she found most settling. She did not comment on this. He did not comment on it. They both understood. There were others who came to Thornwall as the weeks passed, drawn by the gravity of the prophecy's fulfillment. The Alpha of the Western Reaches arrived with her entourage and conducted 3 days of intensive and barely veiled political maneuvering that left the council exhausted and Lyra quietly amused. A representative of the Deep Forest Pack, which had been in philosophical conflict with the Thornwall throne for a generation over questions of autonomy and governance, came with a stack of grievances and the hope that the Arauto's presence might create an opportunity for redress. She spent an afternoon listening to them and then went to Kaelin and said, "Their concerns are legitimate. Have you read the specific grievances?" He said yes. She said, "And?" He said, "Some of them are accurate assessments of actual failures in the treaty implementation. Some are exaggerated for negotiating position. And some are rooted in things that happened before I took the throne, and that I cannot undo, but can potentially address differently going forward." She said, "Would you be willing to say that to them directly?" He said, "I find that kind of directness destabilizing in a political context." She said, "Yes. That's usually why it works." He looked at her with the specific expression she was learning to read as genuine consideration, rather than performance. The expression where his eyes went slightly unfocused, and his jaw was very still, and he was actually processing rather than formulating a response. Then he said, "I'll schedule a meeting with their representative." She said, "I'll sit in if that's acceptable." He said, "I was going to ask." The meeting happened 2 days later, and it was by the measure of most political meetings not a success, because no agreements were reached, and several difficult truths were spoken that left various parties uncomfortable. But it was a beginning. A real beginning rather than a performed one, which was rarer and worth more. And the Deep Forest representative left with an expression that was not satisfied but was something more valuable, which was taken seriously. Lyra thought about what the age of equals might look like in practice. She thought about it in the mornings over the maps, and in the evenings over the texts, and in the courtyard in her raven form when the updrafts carried her high enough that the territory resolved into pattern rather than detail. She began writing, not for anyone else initially but for herself, working out in the privacy of Mira's journal what she thought the prophecies' practical implications might be. The Age of Kings ending did not have to mean violent overthrow. It could mean structural change. It could mean the distribution of the power that currently sat entirely in the throne, the systematic dismantling of a hierarchy that served the people at the top at the expense of the people it was supposed to serve. It could mean councils with genuine authority rather than advisory functions. It could mean clans with real self-governance rather than nominal autonomy. It could mean the formless and the foundlings and the Eastern Quarter people having a voice that was counted. She shared these ideas with Kaelin gradually, not as a strategic presentation, but as a conversation, as the natural extension of the conversations they had already been having. She was not naive enough to think he would simply agree, and he did not simply agree. He pushed back on specifics and challenged assumptions and pointed out where her theoretical framework collided with logistical realities she had not yet learned. But he engaged with it. He engaged with it as a genuine intellectual exercise, and then as something more than that, as something he was actually considering, as though the alternative futures she was describing were not threats to his authority, but possibilities worth assessing on their own merits. This was the thing that undid him, if we are being precise about the chronology, not the mate bond's magic, which he could categorize and contain, not her power, which he could assess and factor, not her presence in the morning courtyard or the evening study sessions or the map room on Sundays. It was the fact that she was actually thinking about how to make the supernatural world better, and she was thinking about it as though his power was a tool to be used for that purpose rather than a mountain to be navigated around, and she was sharing those thoughts with him, because she had decided he was someone who could be trusted with them. He had not been trusted with something genuine in so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to receive it, And the feeling was, he discovered, not comfortable exactly, but something considerably more valuable than comfort. He came to find her on a Tuesday evening when she was not in the study. He checked the courtyard and the library, and eventually found her in the section of the medicinal garden that Mira had been developing, sitting cross-legged on the ground between the lavender and the rosemary, with her paper and her cramped handwriting, and a focused expression that he had learned meant she was working through something complicated. He sat down on the low stone wall near the garden's edge and said, "What are you working on?" She said, "The council structure. I think if the regional alphas had actual voting authority on the interterritorial decisions rather than just advisory standing, you would get better compliance with the decisions because the alphas would own them. Right now they implement because they have to, not because they agreed. The difference matters for stability." He said, "The argument against that has historically been decision speed. Advisory councils can move faster than voting ones." She said, "Faster than what standard?" Most of the decisions that have gone badly for the 4 territories in the last century went badly because they were made quickly by someone who was confident and wrong, not because they were made slowly by a process that included more perspectives. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father would have found that argument genuinely threatening." She said, "I know." He said, "I find it interesting." She looked up from her paper. She looked at him with her gray eyes and the specific quality of attention she brought to things she was actually seeing rather than assessing. And he stayed very still under that attention, the way something wild stays still when something rare approaches. Not from fear, but from the understanding. That movement might end the moment. She said, "Kalen." He said, "Yes." She said, "I know what the prophecy says about the bond. I know what the scholars think it means. I'm not bringing this up as a strategy or a political arrangement, or because of what the prophecy requires. I'm bringing it up because I think you already know what I'm about to say, and I think the honesty is worth more than the performance of not knowing." He said, "And what are you about to say?" She said, "I think we're already in the bond. I think it formed in the courtyard of the Howling clan, and I think we have both been navigating around the fact of it for 6 weeks. And I think the fact of it is not the most interesting part. The most interesting part is what we choose to make of it. And I would like to know what you would choose if the prophecy had nothing to say about it, if it were only a choice between 2 people." The garden was very quiet. The medicinal plants moved slightly in an evening breeze. Somewhere across the palace grounds a door opened and closed. He said, "I would choose this." He indicated, with a gesture that was not dramatic, but was entirely unambiguous, the space between them. He said, "I would choose what is already here. The conversations and the courtyard and the maps and the way you push back on the council dynamics and the tea and the fact that you tell me true things, and I have no idea what to do with that, except not want it to stop." He said it with the specific quality of a man who has not said a true thing out loud in a very long time, and is discovering that it is not actually difficult once the decision to do it has been made. She said, "The tea was a good call." He said, "I was worried it was too obvious." She said, "It was completely obvious." He said, "And?" She said, "And I liked it." If you are still watching and you are feeling the thing I intended you to feel, which is the particular warmth of watching 2 careful and defended people choose each other on purpose, then you understand why I needed to take this long to get here, because it would not have meant anything if it had happened at the campfire on the 4th night, or in the study on the 1st evening. It needed to be earned. It needed to be built from the ground up in truth, rather than dropped from the height of a magical event, and the building of it took exactly as long as it took. They sat in the medicinal garden until the light was entirely gone and talked about what came next, which was both the simplest and most complicated question they had ever considered. Because what came next was not just 2 people and a bond, it was the prophecy and the council, and the Deep Forest representative, and Vorha's maneuvering, and the Western Reaches Alpha's political calculations, and 1,000 years of supernatural world history that had been building toward this moment, and was now waiting to see which direction it resolved. The Age of Equals was not going to happen by announcement. It was going to happen by the sustained, unglamorous, specific work of changing the structures that made the current age of kings possible. Lyra said, "I need you to understand that this is the work I intend to do, regardless of the bond. The structural change, the council reform, the genuine autonomy for the smaller clans. If those things are not compatible with what you want this throne to be, then we need to know that now." He said, "They're compatible." She said, "Compatible as in, you'll tolerate them, or compatible as in you actually want them?" He said, "The second one. I've been wanting something to be for a real purpose for a long time. I would like this to be the purpose." She said, "Then we should start with the council proposal. I want to present it formally next week." He said, "I'll have Sable prepare the briefing materials." She said, "I'll draft the argument." He said, "I know. Your arguments are better than mine." She said, "They're not better. They're different. You have standing I don't have. We present together." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he nodded, and there was something in his face that had not been there in the beginning, something that was not warmth exactly, because he was still architecturally cold in certain ways, but that was adjacent to warmth in the same way that the first light before sunrise is adjacent to day, present and unmistakable even before the full thing arrives. The formal bond acknowledgement happened 3 weeks later, and I want to be precise about what it was and was not, because the story deserves that precision. It was not a ceremony designed to signal political alliance, though it had political implications. It was not a dramatic event witnessed by hundreds, though some people were present. It was a morning in the courtyard that had been theirs for 2 months by the time it mattered. And Lyra was in her raven form, and Kaelin was sitting on the stone bench, and she landed and shifted, and the compass needle that had been pointing at him since the Howling Clan's clearing finally stopped being a compass needle, and became simply the knowledge of where she was relative to where she wanted to be, which was here. And he held out his hand, and she took it, and the bond completed with the same quality as a door opening, not a shattering, but an arrival. The golden script on her feathers changed, not the script itself, which remained the same ancient words, but the quality of the light it held, which deepened from silver to something warmer, something that the scholars, who were called in later, said they had never seen in any interpretation of the ancient texts, but which felt, to both of them, exactly right. The council meeting happened that afternoon with the proposal for regional voting authority on interterritorial decisions. Lyra presented the argument and Kaelin provided the standing, and the council, which had been navigating around the Alpha King like ships around a reef for years, found itself in the strange position of being asked to have actual opinions by a king who appeared to genuinely want them. Several members were disoriented by this. Most of them recovered and found the disorientation worth it. The proposal passed with modifications that improved it, which was exactly what a real council was supposed to do. Vorha's representative sent a message the following week that was considerably less coded than the previous one, essentially acknowledging that the direction of things was clear and suggesting that the Howling Clan would like to be included in the new regional consultation structure. Lyra wrote back a reply that was gracious and specific, and included the relevant documentation for the new council process. She copied Corvin on it, because she was not in the business of petty satisfaction, but she was also not in the business of pretending the history didn't exist. The Deep Forest Pack sent a formal letter requesting the establishment of a grievance resolution process, independent of the throne's direct discretion. Kaelin met with their representative again, this time with Lyra beside him rather than observing, and the meeting lasted 4 hours, and at the end of it, an outline of the process existed on paper, imperfect, and to be refined, but real. These things did not happen quickly. The work of the Age of Equals was not the work of a dramatic event, but the work of days and weeks, and the specific unglamorous persistence of people who know what they are building, and understand that foundations take longer than walls, and walls take longer than rooftops, and that all of it matters equally if the structure is going to stand. Lyra flew in the mornings, and read in the libraries, and worked on the council proposals, and sat with Mira in the evenings, and listened to the old healer's observations about people and power, with the attention they deserved. She learned Thornwall and its territory, and its people, with the specific thoroughness of someone who intended to remain, not as a guest and not as a symbolic figure, but as a person with responsibilities and knowledge, and a stake in the outcome. She made mistakes in the political negotiations, and learned from them. She made friends in unexpected places, including with Sable, who respected competence and found more of it in the Arado than she had been prepared for. Kaelin changed in the way that glaciers change, too slowly to observe in any given moment, but unmistakable over time. He still had the coldness in his public manner, which was partly temperament and partly genuinely useful in the context where it was needed, and she did not ask him to perform warmth he did not feel. What changed was the interior architecture, the framework his father had built in him that had classified feeling as error. He dismantled it carefully and without drama, piece by piece, and replaced it with something he was building himself for the first time, something whose design took input from a gray-eyed woman who had grown up knowing exactly what it cost to be dismissed, and had emerged from that education with a very clear understanding of what mattered and what did not. He laughed more, not loudly or often, because he was still constitutionally himself, but the moments of genuine amusement became visible in ways they previously had not been. He slept better. Sable noticed, because Sable noticed everything, and she did not comment on it, which was her form of approval. The council meetings shifted in texture, without anyone being able to point to a specific cause. The king was still as precise and demanding as always. But there was something in the room that had not previously been present. Something that the council members eventually agreed among themselves was the quality of a man who actually wanted to be doing what he was doing, rather than simply being very good at it. The Western Reaches Alpha returned 6 months later with a proposal for a formal alliance and a private inquiry about whether the Arado's influence on the Thornwall throne would create disadvantages for clans outside the 4 territories. Lyra received the inquiry herself because it was directed at her, and she sat with the Western Reaches Alpha, a woman named Dara who was brilliant and suspicious in equal measure, and had the kind of conversation that neither of them had expected to have, direct and honest, and without the usual diplomatic layering. By the end of it, the alliance proposal was on the table, and Dara was looking at her with the expression of someone who has been surprised in a way they did not resent. The year turned, and the next one began, and the work continued. On the anniversary of Lyra's transformation, the clan elders from across the 4 territories and 3 of the allied packs gathered at Thornwall for the first formal assembly of the new Interterritorial Council, which was not the dramatic institution it would eventually become, but was real in the way that all real things begin, small and imperfect and breathing. Kaelin opened the assembly, and then, with the specific deliberateness of a man who understands the weight of symbols, he stepped back, and Lyra opened the first session in her capacity as herald, which was not a political title but a role, the role the ancient texts had always described, the balance point, the witness, the one whose position outside every existing hierarchy allowed her to serve them all, without being owned by any. She stood in the great hall of Thornwall with the morning light coming through the high windows and the gathered representatives watching her with the full range of expressions that such a room contained, from genuine hope to political calculation to the kind of curiosity that does not yet know what it believes. And she felt the golden script warm on her feathers in her raven form the night before, which she had shifted to in the courtyard at midnight when the palace was quiet and the stars were very clear, and Kaelin had sat on the stone bench and watched her fly with the specific expression of someone watching something rare and being grateful for it. She said, "The Age of Equals is not a destination, it is a direction. And today we choose the direction. If you have stayed with me through this entire story, then you know that the choice the prophecy described was never the dramatic singular moment that 1,000 years of anticipation had imagined it to be. The choice was the courtyard, and the campfire, and the texts, and the tea. The choice was Kaelin not following the elimination protocol. The choice was Lyra getting on the horse. The choice was 2 people deciding, repeatedly and in the ordinary moments that constitute a life, to be honest rather than strategic, to build something rather than simply manage something, to care about the outcome for people who would never know their names. The flame did not rise. The bond was made in truth. And the truth of it was not the prophecy's magic and not the mate. Bonds pull. But the accumulated ordinary truthfulness of two people choosing each other and choosing, together, to use what they had been given for something worth using it for. The golden script on Lyra's wings, which the scholars had debated for a year, was eventually fully translated. It said what Tira had always believed it said, but it said one more thing that had previously been ambiguous. One more phrase that resolved itself now that the outcome existed to provide context for the interpretation. The final line said, "And the age that follows is built not from the herald's power alone, but from every small true thing chosen by every soul who hears the story and decides to carry the direction forward." Mira read the translation and said, "Of course." Lyra asked what she meant. Mira said, "It always ends with the listener. Every good story does. And that's ours. If this story moved you, if it made you feel the weight of quiet choices and the slow building of something real, then leave a comment telling me which moment stayed with you. If you are new here, and you found your way to this story by chance or by recommendation, or by whatever path the algorithm chose for you today, then subscribe, because there are more stories where this one came from. Stories of the extraordinary hiding inside the ordinary. Stories of people who were told they were nothing, and discovered they were something the world had been waiting for without knowing it. And if you have a friend who needs a story like this one, share it with them today. I will see you in the next one.